Hey there, my name is James. Welcome to Game Stories, where we write games that tell stories. And in this episode, we are taking another look at how board games tell stories. In the last Board Game Stories episode, we looked at how mechanics and theme can be blended together so that the mechanics kind of push for a deeper level of thematic engagement from players, therefore making them imagine a different space in that game and producing narrative that way. In this episode, we're looking at some mechanisms that push story in a different way and a little bit more directly than that. So let's dive in and take a look at these examples. Mechanisms. The disclaimer here is don't limit yourself to this list. Study what I said in the last video. Take it seriously. If you've got a theme and mechanics that push players into that theme, you may not need any of the stuff that I'm going to talk about here. But if you are looking for some kind of device that really hits that narrative note, take a look at what's going on here. Okay. First kind of mechanism that I want to talk about is the Book of Passages. When you ask board gamers, hey, what's a game that tells a story? They will point to games like this, like the Tales of Arabian Nights, which let's look at real quick. Tales of Arabian Nights is a board game where you're moving your pawn. I talked about this in a previous video. You're moving your pawn around the board of the Middle East in sort of Aladdin times, and you're stopping in different spaces and making choices and rolling some dice and consulting cards. And as you do so, another player is going to be flipping through this book of tales and giving you options. After you make those choices, you'll be flipping to some passage, and they'll read you what happens to you, right? So this book of tales is full of story that happens to you as you go throughout the game. This game can feel kind of random, and the results that you can get feel kind of random, but it also can be pretty funny and engaging because the passages sort of do respond to the decisions that you make, even if you couldn't necessarily predict the result. Another game that builds on this is several games that build on this. Agents of Smersh is one, and Near and Far is the most recent one that I'm familiar with. You know what, let's just look that up real quick. Near and Far is a game by Ryan Lucott that's really beautifully designed and also uses a paragraph book. The way I think it works in Near and Far, which I haven't played yet, so disclaimer, is that you'll go to different spaces on the map, someone will read you the passage, and inside that passage will be a choice that you make, and then some kind of dice or skill test that you have to meet in order to pass. I don't think I'm going to find a good picture of the book. I'm going to see it off to the side there. There's a big book. There's also a book of maps, so you can sort of flip through this, and the maps evolve over the course of play. You've got a bunch of resources to manage with your people that are walking around, and then you've got choices to make inside that book. So that's another one to look at if you're interested in the paragraph-based system. Although a really different take on that system is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, which also uses a paragraph book or a set of paragraph books, but implements how you navigate that book really differently. Just like the name implies, this is a Sherlock Holmes game. You don't play as Sherlock Holmes, you play as an assistant to Sherlock Holmes, who is also trying to solve the mystery. And you're trying to solve it at least as fast and as well as he does. In all of these case books, they begin with a description of the basic problem, the basic mystery that's occurred, and Holmes sends you out to go solve it. You also have a matching newspaper from that day that he suggests you read over for clues. And then at the end of that, you are turned loose. You have this map of London that has a bunch of numbered spaces on it, and you have a directory of London that has different people. You could look up their names and go find out where they live and go visit that space. There are certain sites on the map where you can generally be guaranteed to run into, for example, the medical examiner or folks from Scotland Yard, or one of your contacts that has some kind of criminal underworld connections that you can talk to. But it's up to you now where you go and what you're looking for. So you might go to the crime scene, which is usually mentioned in the opening paragraphs, and you would look up the crime scene on the map and say, okay, so it's E23. Then you look up E23 in your book, and it gives you a description of what's there. Maybe you interview some people, you get some more clues. Those clues might be names that you could look up in this directory and then go find them. They might be locations that you could kind of scour around on the map and say, okay, maybe we should explore this place. Or they just may be details of the crime that lead you to believe it might be important to see the medical investigator or, the medical examiner or the Scotland Yard or whatever. So you'll just keep visiting locations on the map until you feel like you know enough about the crime to solve it. Then you flip to the end of the book and it asks you some questions. You try to answer them. It gives you a score based on how many you got right and how many steps it took you to get them right. And then Holmes is always frustratingly brilliant and solves the mystery in like 4 moves or something, and you get all mad. But it's really fun, really engaging, and also is a different way of navigating the paragraph architecture. Instead of kind of moving to a spot and then getting a random passage, you're given the map to travel as freely as you like and a pretty good idea of what you might find at any of those locations because you have clues that lead you there, right? So the choices you make about where to go when are driven by knowledge, not by like, oh, I guess I'll go over here on the map, right? This is a good one to look at for if you want to implement paragraph-based story, right? And of course, each one of these books has a bunch of paragraphs in it and is a story of its own, a whole murder mystery that has its own answer, and your way of navigating through that mystery is unique every time. Let's see. So, Book of Passages, having some kind of numbered or lettered passage that players can go to and read some story as they go. That's one way that board games have heavy narrative mechanic, right? Another one is to have a scenario book or a campaign book. I'll tell you what I mean by those. Game is called Betrayal at House on the Hill. It also has a book that comes with it. Oh, this is somebody's Scooby-Doo mod of Betrayal at House on the Hill. It's not a Scooby-Doo game, but it's kind of a Scooby-Doo game. It's a group of people that show up at this haunted mansion together, and you go exploring around it as best you can, collecting items and resources and sort of leveling up your character as you go. And then at some point there's this turn. I forget what they call it. The haunt happens. When the haunt happens, it turns out that one of the players is in fact a traitor to everybody else. None of the players knew this in advance. I don't think you know this in advance. But one of the players turns out to be a traitor and has secretly invited all the other players there to kill them. So now it becomes a one player versus the rest of the players. The other players try to escape. This player tries to get them before they can escape. But the terms of that betrayal at House on the Hill are different every time because you have these books that you hand to the betrayer, and it tells them what kind of betrayer they are. Are they some kind of mad scientist? Are they actually a ghost? Are they a wizard that can shrink everybody really small? Are they... There's many different scenarios that could happen, that will happen and be selected at random, that will give the betrayer extra powers and will give the regular players certain advantages or disadvantages to their escape. And sort of every time you play, at least if you play through all these scenarios, the game will be a little bit different, and the story it tells you will be a little bit different because in these books is a scenario, right? You are a mad scientist and you're trying to use them for your experiments and blah, 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 right? A campaign, but by campaign book, I mean something a little bit different. It's like that. It's like a scenario book, but has a longer arc to the narrative that it's telling. There's 2 links here from Memoir 44. Start with the first one. Memoir 44 is fairly on the light end of the spectrum for war games. Some war gamers wouldn't call it a war game, but it represents battles in World War II between the Allies and Axis forces. You can see there's tiles here on this board, so the setup is modular. It can be different every time. You have a scenario book with a bunch of battles in it when you buy the base game that tell you how to set up the board to have these battles, and it has different win conditions. I think maybe in this one, it's the Nazis defending certain towns, and the Allies have to go and capture a certain number of these tokens, I think. But each scenario will have its own win conditions and its own number of units and its own special conditions, and you'll sort of play cards and roll dice and shoot each other. So the game comes with a scenario book, like Betrayal at the House on the Hill, which sets different rules and setup for the game each time you play. But they also came out with a campaign book for Memoir 44. Well, let's give you a good sense of it. I'm not sure. Yeah, so not only, this is kind of a particular part of the campaign book. Sort of behind here, you can see the setup for any given scenario, which says set up the board this way, use this many pieces, set up these troops here and those troops there. It's got a bunch of different scenarios in it. And it has rules for what to do if player A or player B wins that scenario. So if you have this battle and the Allies win, then advance to this battle. But if you have this battle and the Axis powers win, then go on to this battle. And there's sort of like a branching web of scenarios that you'll have to navigate as you progress through the different possibilities of this campaign, right? That means that each game you play is part of a larger story arc that connects all these battles into a big, movement inside World War II. Not the whole war itself. I don't know if they ever made a book that was like the whole war. But you're progressing through kind of the skirmishes that did happen or might have happened in a particular area of the particular front of the war. I have another example of this. Yeah, Imperial Assault, which is a Star Wars game by Fantasy Flight. See if it loads here. Imperial Assault is kind of a dungeon crawl in Star Wars land, meaning that the board can be set up different every time. This is common for scenario books or for campaign books. You need a modular setup so that you can have scenarios where it says set the board up this way. So you set up the board differently each time. You've got different units that represent the Empire and different units that represent the characters of the Rebellion. One player will play the Empire and will have all of the Stormtroopers and all of the Sith and all of the bad guy robots and stuff. And the other players will play heroes from the Rebellion, and each will control a character like Chewbacca or something. And their job will be to navigate this map and destroy the bad guys and achieve some kind of objective on the map. And each game you play will be set up a little differently. Now, there's a number of modes you can play in this game, but one of them, I think the reason why people get this game is to play the campaign mode. See if this link is still live. Fantasy Flight produced a campaign book, which I try not to spoil too much of. But it gives you each scenario, and it connects the scenarios together. So when this loads, you'll get in. It gives you some rules for how the campaign works, and of course the mandatory scrolling text. And then, for example, you have set up the board like this, put these troops there and these objectives there. Gives you some rules for what people are supposed to do, who wins and who loses, what happens at the end of the mission, and then tells you about the next scenario and the next setup and the next piece of the story. So maybe I don't know what the story is, but maybe they broke into the bunker and now they have to go down to the next level in order to blow up the something or other. Or maybe now they're in the Death Star and you're playing different characters in outer space, right? I know that I don't think there's sort of branching pathways through these scenarios, but I do think that there is some kind of campaign log where you track what you've done, what each character was able to achieve or not able to achieve. There's also side missions that each character is trying to accomplish as they together try to accomplish the big mission. And you're tracking what you've accomplished, and then depending on what you've done in earlier scenarios, different things will or won't happen in later scenarios. There's kind of like a memory to the board game and what might come up in later scenarios. Okay, so I won't hover on that for too long. That's what I mean by a scenario book or a campaign book. I mean a modular game that can be set up differently each time, and there's a book that says set up the game like this with these win conditions, and and then that some kind of story comes out of that, especially in a book like Betrayal that says like now there's this big twist and here's this new situation you weren't aware of before. Or a campaign book where it says let's link these different setups together in a sort of longer narrative arc where your decisions here and the outcome here matters later on, right? That's a much heavier narrative than just playing one game. Another cool technique is the event deck. An event deck is a deck of cards, and you sort of flip one over, and it has some piece of narrative on it, and it tells you a piece of the story, and probably gives you some choices, or tweaks the rules of the game to a certain extent. This can be done poorly. If you don't do it well in your game, it sort of feels like random happening after random happening that you don't have any control over, and players feel like their agency is being taken away by this random deck. But it can also be put to really good use to create thematic engagement and to actually give players more choices or to set up a richer narrative experience than would have been the case otherwise. So let's look at a few examples of event decks. This is Dead of Winter, which is sort of a zombie horror survival board game. There's many of these, but this one is pretty good from what I understand. So you're sort of going to locations, collecting resources, using those resources as a team. You're sort of this is another sort of Battlestar Galactica game where you're working together as a team, but there's someone who's betraying the group. And you're compiling your group resources together in order to overcome obstacles and survive the zombie hordes. There's also a thing called the Crossroads deck. The Crossroads deck is an event deck where if it's the player to your right, I think that's how this goes. If it's another player's turn, you're going to pick up a card and look at it. And there's going to be some kind of trigger condition on the top of the card. This one is called Addiction, and the trigger is if the player plays a medicine card to heal a survivor. So if the active player does that, if they use their medicine to heal somebody, then this card takes effect, and you say, oh, wait, here's what's going to happen. And then it gives the active player a couple of choices about what they can do in response to this. Now, if this doesn't happen, if they don't play medicine to heal anybody, then you just sort of discard the card and you go around. So these events won't always fire, but when they do fire, they fire in response to player choice. Right? It's thematically appropriate to the kind of thing that was just happening. So in this case, this mall Santa survivor guy is going to play this medicine on the dog character who's been wounded to heal them. This card is going to trigger, and it says all this thing about the person's becoming addicted to the pills. And the two options are either the person being healed eats all of the rest of the pills and dies, but you don't reduce morale that day. Or this card goes underneath that character, and they kind of need medicine all of the time. And if they don't get it, then there's a mechanical effect where the group isn't as effective. We lose dice. We need dice, and we might lose some dice if they don't get their medicine every day, right? And you have to make that choice. Do they OD, or do they just survive as an addict now in the community? Hard choice. We can debate whether or not this is a very good or faithful depiction of addiction in the game. But that's the kind of thing that comes out. It's not always addict stuff, but it's always some kind of hard choice, like save the needy survivors and have extra burden, or let them die, right? It's a kind of tough moral choices that you find in a zombie apocalypse are sort of triggered by this deck. Another example of an event deck comes from Fire and Lake, which is a war game that represents the Vietnam War, and it uses its event deck to try to inject a bunch of history theme into the game. I've zoomed in kind of pretty far here. Somebody's laid out all the components of the game. Here's the game board, war zones, and on the side they've sort of laid out all these cards, which if you can see them, you'll be able to tell that there's a bunch of different historical events depicted on them. What you can't see is that there's a number on the top left corner of these cards that is a year. So these cards will sort of get sorted by year and then shuffled randomly. So you can kind of anticipate, if you know the history, like the kinds of things that will be coming out in different years, but not necessarily in what order. When you stack the deck, you flip one over, and this event card changes the rules for the round in some way. You also flip over the top part of the deck so that players can see what's coming next. So you might have, like, Henry Kissinger's in play doing something that changes the diplomatic relationships or something in certain countries, and you know that next turn Claymore mines are going to be introduced that change up the rules of engagement or something, right? So you can kind of strategize based on that. And through this, you get a bunch of historical flavor and historical story interjected into what's a really pretty heavy strategy game about moving cubes around and having the most influence and battling each other, right? So this injects a lot of theme. A couple more examples of this to get through. The Legends of Andor. These next two are pretty interesting ones and almost like push the boundaries of what can be considered an event deck. Legends of Andor's deck is sort of like a cross between a campaign or a scenario book and an event deck. Here's Legends of Andor, all laid out with all the components. Players work together as a cooperative fantasy team against the board game system, which sort of throws a bunch of monsters at them and dragons and stuff that they have to beat. And they play through a series of adventures to try to get to the end of the story. It's Legends of Andor, and each game is sort of us playing through one of the legends. You can see kind of over here, there's these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decks of cards. Each one of these decks is a different adventure, a different scenario, and a different story. You don't shuffle these cards at all. You just stack them up in the order that they go, and as you flip them over, they tell you the rules, the setup, and the rules for the scenario. So you set up the board the way they tell you. And then there's cards that trigger. There's a white pawn that goes here, and different game events will trigger it to advance up this track. And as it does, if it gets to, letter B, then you'll flip over the B cards and read about some kind of event that's happening inside the story, probably changes the rules on the map, maybe brings out some more bad characters or increases the tension in some way, maybe gives you some kind of benefit. But it's telling you the story as you go along. After you win this scenario, then you go to the next deck the next time you play, and then you flip over the first cards. It tells you how to set up the board. This board is also double-sided. I think on the back it's like a cave zone or something, or a big tree. Can't remember which. And so you keep playing through these decks of cards and their events, advancing this track, finding out new story information, and in this way, the heroes progress through this campaign of 6 different adventures, right? That are all kind of triggered at certain game points by player decision, driving the story forward. One more example of this is Time Stories, which is a board game about time-traveling folks that go through time and try to solve problems. Pictures here is a little bit smaller, but I think you can see the worker placement pawns of the different characters. Again, you'll flip over cards that tell you the rules of the game. And then they'll tell you to set up these different scenes. You can see how these, the art on these cards all kind of lace together to form an area. And then different players can go to different locations inside that scene and flip these cards over and read a part of the story about what happened in that area at that time. And it's because different players are getting different pieces of the story, you all have different parts of the whole. And not all of it, right? Because not all of the places will be visited. Some of the cards will go unread, which means you might have to loop back through. You might lose the first time and loop back through time again, reassemble the deck and go back through all these places and visit different places to try to get a clearer picture so that you can take the right actions to win the game. And Time Stories has sort of published a bunch of different decks of cards that tell different kinds of stories, right? There's like a zombie one, and there's a fantasy one, and there's this, I think this sort of old insane asylum one and stuff like that. So making choices about where to go, having unequal information, trying to collaborate on what you should do. So that's event decks, flipping over cards, getting pieces of story. Preferably, you can see in all of these different situations, there's some kind of player control over what's happening. The least control here, interestingly, is Fire in the Lake, where it just happens to you, changes the rules. But you can also anticipate what's coming up, and you can also anticipate historically the kinds of things that might happen. In Dead of Winter, the cards don't always trigger. They only trigger if you make a decision that's thematically appropriate, right? In Legends of Andor, it's sort of like the whole campaign is contained in the deck, and it advances, the story advances as players make certain kinds of choices to advance through that deck. And then in Time Stories, the narrative is spread out, and players are trying to uncover it as they loop through this deck a number of times. A bunch of different ways to use that technology to tell a story. There's also the legacy format. The legacy format is a style of play, a style of game where the game components and rules themselves evolve over time as players play a bunch of different games. Let's take a look at Risk Legacy, which is the first of these games. Rob Davio is the designer here. This is, if you haven't played this and you don't want anything spoiled, probably don't look at the board. But this is what the board looks like after many, many plays by a group of players. You can see there's stickers all over it. There's people's names, who's won the game has been written on it. There's new lines on the map drawn to different places, new islands and territories, different kinds of effects and cities and stuff. These are because certain game conditions trigger, and certain win and loss conditions trigger and give players the power to permanently alter the map by either drawing something on it or placing a sticker on it that changes the dynamics forever, right? So your Risk Legacy board, when you're finished with your number of plays, it looks really different from my Risk Legacy board when I'm finished with my number of plays. Another important piece of this is that not only is the board changed, the other thing is you're like ripping up cards and stuff and throwing away game components and stuff. So it's permanently altered. But the other thing is that you're not just like changing what's there, you're adding new stuff in as you go. I think this picture is in German, so it won't quite make full sense. But inside the box there's these packets. And on the packets it says like, when a player is eliminated from the game for the first time, open this pack. Or when somebody wins by doing such and such, open this pack. Or when there's a certain number of cities on the board, open this pack. And each of these packs has different stuff in it. Different cards to be added to the game, different materials to be able to play the game with, different sticker sheets that you'll actually remove and like place in the rule book so new rules happen. So that means as you play through the game and trigger these events at different times, the game will suddenly change in nature. There may be new factions that come out, there may be new events that come out, there may be new stickers that come out, and your experience of playing the game gets more complex over time and also starts to tell a different kind of story, right? Now there's this kind of stuff happening that you have to deal with. There's a bunch of different legacy games, well, not so many, but there are several more, and two of them that have come out recently. One's not specifically called Legacy, but it has that same kind of design style. Two of these are like some of the highest rated board games of all time, all of a sudden, even though they came out fairly recently. Let's sort this list by rank, and you'll see what I mean. The number one rated board game on BoardGameGeek is Pandemic Legacy Season 1. This is a game, there was a game called Pandemic where you play members of the World Health Organization, and you're going around trying to fight diseases around the world. Pandemic Legacy is that game, but also having the legacy elements of Risk Legacy, meaning as you're fighting these diseases, certain events trigger, and then the board is permanently changed, and the cards are permanently changed, and new stuff comes out. The characters that you play are permanently changed. They may die, they may grow, they may evolve into different people. And so there's this sort of evolving narrative that happens as you go through the process of playing several games. Kind of like a campaign book where it says, make these changes to the way that you're playing over time, only with the added addition of, here's new components to deal with, here's new rules to deal with, here's the board permanently changed forever to deal with, right? Gloomhaven is another one. It's sort of a fantasy game where you sort of progress a character up and they may sort of retire and then new characters come out, and it's a very deep and heavy game. I'm not going to even start to brush all of it. But this is ranked number 4. So this style of play is very popular because it's really deeply thematically immersive, right? People feel like they're excited to discover new stuff as they play. It's like opening new board games all the time. And also each piece sort of changes the story of the game for that particular group of players. They feel like they're in a unique experience that's emergent, right? Because they are. All right, that's legacy play. And then finally, I mean, there's more stuff we could have talked about, but then there's storytelling as a mechanism. And that just means that in the game rules it says players tell a story to each other. And here's some stuff to help you do that. A couple examples of this are Once Upon a Time, which is a card game. Let's see, what picture have I used here? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to tell from these cards, but you'll have a series of cards that have like nouns and actions on them, and you'll be playing them, telling a story like the queen once wanted to marry a giant, and so they went off into the wild and discovered a secret fountain, and you'll be playing cards that sort of match the elements of the story that you're playing. Other players will have a chance to interrupt you and start using their cards to build on that story, and you'll kind of go back and forth, trying to get rid of your cards and trying to advance the story to a place where you can play your goal card. Every player has a goal card like this that is the ending that they want the story to have. So everybody's trying to kind of progress the narrative. These are pretty smart. Toward this goal. So you can see this player is trying to get to, with the rival dead, they could be married at last. So in order for me to achieve that, I'm going to need to make sure there's a rival in the story, two people who want to be married but can't because of the rival, and then a death event that takes the rival out of the picture. So I'm going to be, working that angle of the narrative. Meanwhile, somebody else is working a completely different angle in the narrative and interrupting me to take the narrative in different directions. And we'll tell this story together until finally someone gets rid of their cards and says, boom, with the rival dead, they can be married at last, right? Another example of that that's sort of a little simpler and more to the point is Rory's Story Cubes, which is just a set of dice that you roll, and they have different pictures on them, and then you put them together to tell some kind of story, right? So here's the player rolled the dice, and they might say, once upon a time there was a very dramatic bee who wanted to travel the earth in search of justice, right? And you sort of piece these together and tell a story, re-roll it and do it again. There's different rules about how to do this, but it's basically just a storytelling activity that you can play by rolling these dice and putting the pictures together into whatever kind of narrative sense makes sense to you. There were different sets of these that have come out to add more symbols to the game or more different kinds of themes. And recently there was also a Kickstarter for a more complex storytelling game that uses Rory Story Cubes in a more sort of structured way. I can't quite explain how this works. I haven't learned it yet. It hasn't come out yet. But there's sort of cards that come out and have different kind of features of the story that you'll use cubes to fill in. And it's a more of like a structured progression through a kind of like TV show story or something. With different cards that come into play. So this is a little bit more advanced, building on Rory Story Cubes to give a little more dramatic arc to the kinds of things, instead of just like randomly trying to assemble objects that make some kind of narrative together. This gives you a little more like main characters and the challenges they face, and the struggle to overcome those challenges, and then the climax, and then the after of the denouement or whatever. So, another example of that. Okay, that was a bunch of different mechanisms. To review, there are mechanisms out there, and there's probably more than these that I should be listing. If you can think of some, feel free to mention them in the comments. But there are board game mechanisms that are like there for the purpose of pushing story, or they do other things too, but they also do a really good job of pushing story into the game. One is the Book of Passages, which is just a book of numbered passages, which one way or another get activated, and someone will read a chunk of story when you get to them. Another is a campaign book, which is, in a modular setup game, you can have a bunch of scenarios and then string them together in some way that creates a larger arc, or you can just have a scenario book that adds some kind of plot twist in the middle of the game, like Betrayal at House on the Hill. Event cards can be used in a bunch of different ways to, flip over and tell a piece of story. Those can trigger just once each round, but have some anticipation, or they can have, in-game triggers so that they're thematically appropriate, or they can kind of progress through a fixed narrative. and maybe have like only parts of that narrative visible at any given time. There's the legacy format where the components change and the rules change over time, which means there can be big impacts to armies or to characters depending on the scale of your game, and they'll have some kind of dramatic arc or fate that happens over the course of the game. And then there's also just the storytelling mechanic where you say players tell a story, and here's some stuff to push you into doing that in a particular structure. So any of those are great. Those are all great pieces if you really want to hit a thematic note or a narrative note. Study these, look carefully at these and the examples there. Dive through Boardgamegeeks and look at all this stuff. Look at videos of how the different games work. And of course, this disclaimer again: any good blend of story-rich theme and immersive mechanics will work. You don't have to use these to tell stories, but they're good at doing it. They're good at bringing narrative into the picture. Okay, that's it. I'm not going to talk any longer about this. Just wanted to make sure that you were aware of some of the different ways modern game design works board game design works to sort of bring narrative into the picture. Okay, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.